I want to thank you for coming today. This is Steve Dale here from beautiful Pacheco here. And this is the first of a series of programs we're going to be doing here. So we're streaming live to YouTube. And we also have a number of folks that are in the audience. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the basics of the ABLE Act here. And when we're done, we'll be able to take questions. Amy will be monitoring the chat for those of you that are watching at home here, and then for the rest of you, you don't have to type it in. We can actually talk here, and we'll answer as many questions as we can. The other thing, for those of you that are watching this on our YouTube channel, there is a playlist, and I think at this point we have 17 videos on the ABLE Act. For those of you that are professionals, we will be doing some CLE programs on the ABLE Act as well. And the other way to find the playlist is if you go to achievingindependence.com/ABLE. That will take you to the playlist as well. So let's begin, and we're just going to walk through this and go through the basics, and then we'll field some questions, and then we'll go home. Anyway, and as always here, the following information is intended for guidance only, and it's not a substitute for legal counseling. Okay, so let's go through a couple of major things of basics as we go through this. And just kind of an explanation before we get into the ABLE Act and why it is that this might be so important. Here, the ABLE Act is a program that's actually relatively new. The first program opened up in Ohio in June of 2016. My office, both for the law office and for the Golden State Pool Trust, have been using ABLE accounts for our beneficiaries and for our clients from early inception, and we found it to be a really good tool, and it works especially well with special needs trusts in a number of different situations. You know, as we kind of go through this, the value of the ABLE Act here in many ways is that it's very good for folks that are working disabled, as we can go through later, because it's very common that for folks that are working that they'll keep going over the $2,000 resource limit, which is $2,000 today. It's also, as we're going to do, this something astounding for housing, and it gives a latitude we've never had before. The thing I want to get across as we go through this is that even though this was set up to be something simple, I don't think the word simple and disability go together very well. So there's a number of issues we're going to want to look at, such as, you know, what you can use it for, how much you can contribute. For many folks who might have loved ones with cognitive issues, issues as far as capacity and that sort of thing. So once again, my hope is that you'll get a basic understanding about how this works and how this might either work for you or work with your loved one with a disability. So here's the first thing that we cover when we talk about the ABLE Act is who is eligible. Okay, in order to be eligible for an ABLE account, you have to show you were disabled before the age of 26. Now, a lot of people ask, why is that? And the reason is that the original version of the ABLE Act actually had no age limitation, and as we're going to see, it had no limitation on how much you could put into it, and it actually scored such a high Congressional Budget Office score, CBO score, that Congress decided to limit how many people could join. So the way they did it is limited by age and limited by amount. Okay, so the first part of that is if you're receiving some sort of a disability-related benefit before the age of 26, you automatically qualify. So that could be something like SSI, Social Security disability benefits. It could be childhood disability benefits. It could be Medi-Cal or Medicaid if you're watching this in another state, if you're doing it based on disability. If you're receiving those benefits before the age of 26, you automatically qualify, and there's nothing more to do. Now, for instance, in our office, we work with a lot of folks that have mental health diagnoses. And it's really common that maybe the disability really began before the age of 26, but maybe they didn't get a diagnosis, or maybe they didn't start receiving the benefits here until maybe they're in their late 20s or 30s. In fact, I just worked with somebody where they didn't get their diagnosis until the mid 30s. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't qualify for an ABLE account. If you get a doctor's certification that you probably would have qualified for one of the benefit programs, or that your disability began before the age of 26, that's all that's needed. I have to tell you, almost every person that I've worked with a mental health diagnosis, we've been able to do it just with the doctor's letter. And as we're going to see as we go through this, unlike Social Security, where there's a lot of scrutiny, with ABLE accounts here, there's very little scrutiny. So once you get the certification, for many programs, when you try to sign up, they want you to say that you have the certification, but they actually don't want a copy of it. It's just that loose. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't sign up without a certification here, but this is one of those things where there's very little scrutiny involved in these programs. And in many ways, that's a good thing. In some ways, maybe it's not. If the ABLE account beneficiary qualifies because of a certification here, ABLE eligibility cannot be used to secure SSI or SSDI or Medi-Cal. So it's a good program, but it's not that good. Okay, so if you still have to, if you're going to get the certification, and if you're going to go further and actually try to qualify for SSI, you still have to go through the same process of making an application here. Key features of this is contributions into an ABLE account can be made by any person. Now, very recently, we got um, some regulations from Social Security that clarifies a lot of this. And one of the things that they clarified is that a person could be a trust. Okay, so once again, the concept of person is very loose. It could be a trust, it could be an annuity, it could be almost anything here as far as making a contribution to it. Contributions are not tax deductible, although as we'll be talking a little bit about CalAble here in a bit. The CalAble program will have a small state deduction here, but federally there is no tax deduction. Some states will have tax deductions, state tax deductions for their residents in their state. In California, when CalAble is up and running, that will be one of the benefits of the CalAble program. Income earned by the account would not be taxed. And in fact, the proper name for these programs is that this is a 529A program. It's actually part of the tax code. It's a variation of a 529 plan, which is normally used for college accounts here. And just like a normal 529 plan, the income earned from the investments in the ABLE account are not taxed. Account withdrawals for qualified expenses. And we're going to go through this. This is a new concept. It's called qualified disability expenses are not taxed as long as what you're doing are things that are allowed. Individuals are limited to one account, and the total contributions for any individual can't be any more than whatever the gift tax limit is for that year, which this year it is $15,000. There's a cost of living adjustment, so someday it'll go to 16, someday it'll go to 17, whatever. Once again, now the reason for that, once again, was to limit the amount that could go into the ABLE account so it could pass through Congress and meet the CBO score. Aggregate contributions are subject to an overall limit matching whatever the state limits are for 529 plans. We're going to go into that here in just a moment here. So for instance, when the CalAble program is up and running, and I should probably just mention right now, our expectation is that CalAble itself will be up sometime late in the year. It might be as late as early next year, but eventually it will be up and running. But as I'm going to cover, for those of you that are interested in this program, you can actually use it now. Now, the example would be in California, if you join the Cal-Able program, the most you could put into that account would be $475,000 because that's the most you can put into a normal 529 plan. Now, just doing a little math, and this isn't accurate, if we don't count in the investments and the administrative costs and all that, if you put in the maximum distributions, it would take 31.6 years to hit that amount. I've got a sneaking suspicion I will never see a maxed out Able account here. But once again, that's the most you could put into it. Individuals with Able accounts maintain their eligibility for means-tested programs, and the main means-tested programs we're talking about are SSI and Medicaid. So once again, here's the concept. As long as the amount in the Able account is no more than $100,000, you continue to qualify for your SSI. So we're going to see when it goes over $100,000, your Able account will be placed in suspension, but you still qualify for Medi-Cal or Medicaid in other states. Okay. Now the thing to look at, and for those of you that have children with disabilities, you might want to watch the video on the basics of benefits, because the fact is, if you have a child who is disabled, here, when the parents become disabled themselves, retire, or pass away, oftentimes they'll qualify for a program called Childhood Disability Benefits, and they may not be on SSI anyway. It really depends on your situation. So let's dig a little deeper into this. If the beneficiary is receiving SSI when the assets in the account total $100,000, the SSI is placed in suspension, meaning that as long as you follow all the other rules, you don't have to reapply when the account drops back below $100,000. If the assets in the Able account drop below $100,000, then the SSI benefits resume as long as you follow all the other rules. So, and here's the key thing. The beneficiary will not have to reapply for SSI when it drops back below $100,000. So, with that, Able account beneficiaries do not lose their Medi-Cal eligibility. In many cases, it's the Medi-Cal that becomes the most important program here when it goes into suspension. And so going back to this, if you use another state, if you were to join the Able program in Arizona, the most you could put there would be $412,000 because that's the most you could put into an Arizona 529 plan. Therefore, if contributions exceed $100,000, the SSI would be suspended, but as long as the account remains below $412,000, Medi-Cal or Medicaid would continue. So part of this is, what can you contribute into an Able account? And the fact is, you can only contribute cash. So for instance, you can't take an appreciated stock and put it in the Able account and not realize the gain. If you had an appreciated stock, here you'd have to sell it, realize the gain, and then put what's left over into the Able account as cash. Or for instance, if you had a qualified plan, a 401k, an IRA, that sort of thing, you can't place those in an Able account. You would have to cash it out, pay the taxes, and then put what's left into the account. Now here's something that's really been in development, and one thing about Able programs is that the rules keep changing. Okay, well, like a lot of things in disability, there's very little that's static. So what can you use? What is a qualified disability expense? And I'll walk through this one time, and then what I'm going to show you is it actually doesn't matter. You can use it for education, housing, transportation, employment training and support, assistive technology and related services, personal support services, health prevention and wellness, financial management and administrative fees, legal fees, well, isn't that nice, here, expenses for oversight and monitoring, funeral expenses and burial expenses. And the IRS recently added basic living expenses. Now, just tell me, what is it you spend money on that's not a basic living expense? And I think most of the able advocates have kind of determined the only things that really break the rule is everybody seems to agree that gambling is not a basic living expense, even in Nevada here, and making gifts to someone else is not a basic living expense. After that, we haven't figured out what is not a basic living expense. For instance, we have a beneficiary who is using his ABLE account for medical marijuana, or we call it medicine here, and apparently that's been okay because that's a basic medical expense. Probably depends on your perspective, but apparently it works. Now, I get this, well, then the next thing comes up is when the money is in the ABLE account, what kind of investments can you do and how do you do the investments? Now, this is exactly the same as a traditional 529 plan. If you're looking at setting up an ABLE account and day trading with this money, this is the wrong thing to do. A beneficiary or the person, as we're going to see, with signature authority over an ABLE account can change the investments no more than 2 times in a calendar year. What you'd find with most of the ABLE programs is they have a whole series of investment options, and you can mix and match your investments here, but you can only change them twice a year. With that, once again, they normally give you this full range of options. For instance, I set up an ABLE account for my niece here in New York. And with that, we were able to take the money we put in that ABLE account and put a little bit from this portfolio and a little bit from that portfolio to diversify things. But this would be determined by the states. Another question I had yesterday was, when will Wells Fargo or Bank of America or that have their ABLE programs? And the answer is never. These are run by the state treasurer's offices. So once again, these are all run by the state treasurer's offices, and whoever they contract with, that is who determines the investments. As far as tax-free growth and penalties for non-qualified expenses here, contributions are in after-tax dollars, but earnings would grow tax-free just like a normal 529 plan, or even somewhat like like an investment account. Okay. Withdrawals must be for qualified expenses, or else the earnings portions would be subject to regular income tax and a 10% penalty. Once again, it's pretty broad what you can use an ABLE account for here. So once again, the examples they actually give us from Social Security is an example where somebody took the money and went out and went gambling with it, and there they imposed a penalty on it. Now, as I mentioned, even though CalABLE is not expected to be up, and we're recording this in April of 2018, so it may be up and running by the end of 2018, maybe as late as early 2019, but you can actually open up an ABLE account now. Originally, you had to open up the account in the state that you lived in, but that was changed at the last moment, so you can open up an ABLE account and anywhere you like. I personally have enjoyed working with the Ohio program. I found them very good to work with. But if you want to do a comparison and look at ABLE accounts across the country, you can Google the ABLE National Resource Center. And with the ABLE National Resource Center, they have a really good tool that compares the plans across the country. I think there's something like 38 plans across the country, of which about 30 of them will actually take out-of-staters here. But you still only can have one ABLE account. So they have a pretty elaborate tracking system. And so let's say, in our case, let's say Uncle Steve and Aunt Terry, we opened up an ABLE account for our niece. Let's say that another aunt and uncle did the same thing for my niece. There's a tracking system where that comes up, and whoever set up the last account has 90 days to either to merge them together if you stay below the $15,000 or eliminate the second account. Okay. Now, one thing unique about ABLE accounts, and I'm going to approach this first off from a national perspective, and then we'll look at this from a California perspective here, is that with these accounts, there is a lien for any Medi-Cal or Medicaid you've used from the time the account is set up. So once again, as it says, that's one unique niche feature of this. The fact that there's a lien upon the death doesn't lessen the value of this tool. It's just another factor. And I will tell you, as we start talking about application, for most of the folks we've worked with, we haven't really been using this as a savings plan. We've been using it for other purposes, especially when we're dealing with housing. So a lot of these accounts have been money in, money out. But if you are using it for a savings plan here and you're building it up, you need to be aware that federally there's a lien, although we're going to see, because we're California, of course, we're going to do something different. Here, in the event the qualified beneficiary dies with remaining assets in the account, the assets are first distributed to any state Medicaid plan that provided medical assistance to the beneficiary from the time the account was created. Okay? And this is kind of a different concept. So, for instance, many of the beneficiaries we've worked with have opened up their accounts in Ohio. And even when the CalAble is up and running, if you use another state's plan, you will be subject to these rules. And since CalAble isn't up right now, you would be subject to that now. So at the time of this presentation, here, Pennsylvania, Oregon, and California, and my understanding is Florida is going to do the same thing for their residents, have laws that prevent their citizens from being subject to the payback here for their program as long as you use their program. If the able beneficiary moves to another state and uses Medicaid, then there would be a lien in that state. One of the biggest exports we have in California is Californians here. So many of us do move from time to time. So even if you set up a CalAble program here without the lien, if you move to, let's say, Oregon, the account would be subject to a lien for any Medicaid used from the time they move to Oregon. Here. For specifics for your state, you need to check with your programs. So let's just kind of go through this a little bit, because especially when we start talking about housing, this will become more relevant. Across the country, the general rule is that anyone who uses Medi-Cal, any kind of Medi-Cal, there's a lien for any Medi-Cal or Medicaid you've used for medical purposes after the age of 55. In California, that was changed, and we'll get into this a little bit more. They added that passes through probate, and we'll go through what that means in a bit. For an ABLE account, the amount of the Medi-Cal payback here is calculated based on the amount paid by Medi-Cal after the creation of the account. So if you had a 10-year-old, for instance, here that was getting Medi-Cal, maybe through institutional deeming or something, and let's say you set up the account when they're 16, and let's say they passed away when they were 20, the lien would be from 16 forward, not from day one. A third-party special needs trust, which is your normal estate planning trust, has no lien at all because the beneficiary actually doesn't own what's in the account. It's for their use, but not for, but they actually don't own it. Okay, so here's the things to consider. Is the able beneficiary currently on Medi-Cal? You know, many folks with disabilities are, but not everyone. Some services for children are based on Medi-Cal waivers, and it's not always apparent. So for many folks that are clients of the regional center, they may be getting Medi-Cal through what's called institutional deeming or the developmental disabilities waiver. Okay. Is the able beneficiary using the Medi-Cal? You may be qualified, but you may not be using it here. And some folks use minimal amounts of Medi-Cal. Some people use massive amounts of Medi-Cal. Does it matter? And we get a lot of folks who, families and persons with disabilities, that actually don't mind having that paid back, kind of the thought being that they got assistance during their lifetime, and they don't mind paying back the government for some of the services that they received. I would say that's a small minority, but a lot of people feel that way. Now, this is a really important section here, especially for parents that are looking at um, setting this up for a loved one here, which is who can establish and, more importantly, who can manage an ABLE account. So the new concept we have is the person who can establish the account here. That's pretty straightforward. But the person who's in control of the account is the person with signature authority. Okay, and it's the same group of people that can both establish the account and also that have signature authority. So that would be the eligible individual, the person with the disability themselves, an eligible individual's agent under a valid power of attorney. Okay, if none, his or her parents or their legal guardian or conservator. Now, I'll give you an example in my case. We set up an ABLE account for my niece who has Down syndrome. She's in New York. She certainly has her challenges. Is she incompetent? No. Here she certainly can express her wishes sometimes when you wish she wouldn't here, but she certainly is competent. She can't add up a column of numbers. She certainly can't keep a checkbook, and nor can Uncle Steve here, but she certainly is competent. She could set up an account, and she could also manage the account here. In my case, I wanted to be one of the first Californians to open up an ABLE account here. But in order for me to do that, you'll notice that the folks who can set up the account, it doesn't say uncle here, it doesn't say trustee. So the account in that case, we had it set up by her mother, her parent, and that's who could establish the account. And then Uncle Steve and Aunt Terry were free to make contributions into the account. Let's say Erica didn't have capacity. Or the other things you want to look at is that um, the law assumes that if the person has capacity, that they are to be in control of the account unless there's a reason otherwise. So this would be something else to consider, because we work with a lot of folks who maybe they're not incompetent, but they do have capacity issues, or they might be subject to undue influence. So in that case, you might want to be really careful about how much you put in the account. We'll go back to my niece as a good example. With my niece, and one of the cool things about an ABLE account is she's been on SSI her entire life. She has never bought anything for herself. Well, now she's learning how to use the ABLE account, and she's in the stable program, which is Ohio's program, which has a debit card, and now she's able to go and make purchases. The thing is, for a lot of people in my niece's situation, they don't really learn how to manage funds because they never have access to managing funds. And we're actually using this as a tool to not only make gifts here and there, but also to give Erica the chance to learn how to manage funds and gain that experience. So here's a scenario you might look at. Here, Fred and Wilma have a daughter named Pebbles who was born with a severe developmental disability. And before I go through this, we should recognize that disability is a broad spectrum, and there's a vast number of folks with disabilities who certainly have capacity and can manage things and probably wouldn't appreciate you trying to help them. On the other hand, we have a lot of folks on the other end of the spectrum who may have different variations of being able to manage things, and this is what I want you to think about. So they have a daughter named Pebbles with a severe developmental disability. Fred and Wilma establish an ABLE account under their authority as Pebbles' parents. So far, so good. Pebbles lacks capacity to manage her account or execute a power of attorney. Fred and Wilma maintain signature authority over the account as parents. Fred and Wilma pass away in a tragic accident, and their neighbors and best friends, Barney and Betty, step in to take care of Pebbles. In order for Barney and Betty to assume signature authority over Pebbles' account, they will need to become Pebbles' guardian or conservator. This would be a situation where you really need to think through, if you have a loved one you're setting this up who doesn't have capacity here, how are you going to manage that account if something happens to the person who has signature authority? So a couple of things here. If the individual under an ABLE account has capacity, you should have them sign a power of attorney immediately, right? Naming who it is they would like to manage the account if they lost capacity here. Or the other issue may be that I have a number of, clients that definitely do have capacity, but maybe they have cerebral palsy or something like that, where it's really difficult for them here to write or work with computers and that sort of thing. So they might want to give a power of attorney to somebody who can assist them to manage the account. The other thing is, let's say they would like to have somebody other than their parents manage the account, maybe their spouse, a brother or sister, whatever. A power of attorney is the way to do it. So basically, if you set up an ABLE account and you have capacity, you should immediately sign a power of attorney. And many of the ABLE programs actually have powers of attorney you can download. Here. If the individual wants to have a sibling, for instance, have signature authority, then the power of attorney is the method to make that happen. So in determining whether an ABLE account is right for you or your loved one as far as capacity, if the ABLE beneficiary has capacity to manage his or her account, have them sign a power of attorney in the event that they lose capacity in the future. If the designated beneficiary lacks capacity to manage the account, and you have signature authority, think about what you're going to need to do to have some successor who's going to be able to manage that account. This next thing I'm going to go through, dealing with housing for SSI recipients, is a huge value, and I've been able to help many families be able to save here about $3,000 a year. And here's the sad thing: you don't even need an attorney. So let's walk through this. And what this is going to be is the number you see up there, which says SI01130.740. Here, that's what's called a POMS site. If you ever call Social Security, it doesn't seem like they're reading a script. They're reading a script, and that's what's called the Program Operation Manual System. If you Google SI01130.740, my website will come up, and so will the Social Security website, which will take you right to these regulations. So here's what the regulations say. They say, do not count an ABLE account distribution as income. Here, a distribution from an ABLE account is not income. It's a conversion of a resource from one form to another. Do not count distributions from an ABLE account as income, regardless of whether they are for non-housing qualified disability expenses, housing qualified disability expenses, or non-qualified disability expenses here. So what does that mean? No matter what you do with the account, even if you use it here in most situations for something you're not supposed to use it for, it doesn't count as income for SSI purposes. What we're really going to focus on is housing. Okay, so here's the thing that comes up, and sometimes for families we work with, this is one of the most perplexing things about SSI. So here's the basic concept. SSI originally was set up for food. Clothing we don't count any longer. That was taken away. The restrictions on clothing were taken away in 2005. And shelter. Okay, and so the basic concept is the federal part of the SSI, which is currently $750 here, is for food, clothing we don't count any longer, and shelter. And the concept is that if somebody is assisting them with their shelter, even a parent that's allowing them to live in the home without their paying what Social Security considers their fair household expense, what will happen is their benefits will be reduced by dollar for dollar for the value of the assistance, capped at $270. So the 1/3 reduction is 1/3 of the SSI plus $20. Now that just sometimes is just really hard to understand, because you would think because you're helping your loved one with a disability that you would get a bonus for that instead of getting having their benefits reduced, but that's how it works. We have a state supplement, so our current SSI rate is $910.70. So let's say your child is living with you, and let's say you take everything but the food there, the mortgage, real estate taxes, rent, heating, fuel, gas, electricity, water, sewer, and garbage. Let's say you take all those expenses for your house, and let's just say, for sake of argument, it comes up to $3,600, and it is you, your spouse, and your child that's on SSI. Okay, their fair share would be $1,200, 1/3 of $3,600. Now it's kind of hard to pay $1,200 with $910.70, which it's impossible to do that. So since they're unable to pay you their fair share, although there's nothing fair about this, they'll take that reduction of the $270, meaning that you'll get less SI. This is the part that's really astounding. The concept here is, since the money that goes into the ABLE account belongs to the SSI recipient, they're now paying their own rent. If they pay you the rent from the ABLE account here, in this case, let's say the $1,200, they're paying you rent with their own money, and they don't take the reduction. For those of you that might be confused by this, because sometimes it's hard to get your arms wrapped around it, there is a video on my YouTube channel specifically on this. But let's go through a couple of examples about how this works. Okay, this one I call a little help from friends. So let's say Belinda has been disabled from birth and is receiving $910.17 a month in SSI. A major expenditure for her are going to be housing and utility payments, okay, here. And she'd like to live in a nicer apartment that would cost $1,000 a month. Now, for those of you that are watching this, we're in California. I don't know where you would get an apartment for $1,000 a month, but let's make believe that's possible, okay? So she's going to need some assistance to make that move. So if Belinda's parents were to give her $1,000 directly and say, honey, you just take this $1,000 and you go pay the rent, that's unearned income. That's not going to work. That's going to wipe out the SSI completely. If her parents were to pay the landlord directly, the payments would count as in-kind support and maintenance. That's the reduction we had talked about. And her benefits would be reduced by $270. And that's what we've done for years and years and years. If instead they were to contribute $1,000 a month into her ABLE account, and in turn the funds from the ABLE account were used to pay the landlord, then there would be no reduction in SSI. I'll go a step further. I did a workshop a while back where a mother came up to me and she goes, well, Mr. Dale, we're in a different situation. Much like I had described, they had figured out that my daughter's fair share here of the housing was, let's say, $1,200 a month. We'll go back to that. So I said, well, here's what you do. Take $1,200, put it in the ABLE account, and her daughter doesn't have capacity. Okay, she is the person with the signature authority, but even though she has signature authority, that's really her daughter's money. With her authority to do this as the parent, she took the $1,200, goes back and pays herself the rent here. Then she takes that $1,200 the next month, puts it right back in the ABLE account, and does the same thing next month. My wife describes it as we're laundering money, and yes, we're laundering money right out in the open. Now, she went down to Social Security, and they said, well, you can't do that here. And I had her take a copy of the Palms down. So if you're going to do this, what you'd want to do is Google the Palms site that I gave you, copy that, take that down to Social Security and say, this is what we're doing. Now my son or daughter is paying me the rent, which is, that meets the fair share. It's a numbers game here. And with that, this is a way where you can save $270 a month, which works out to about $3,000 a year, which is a fair amount of money for somebody who's on SSI. So anyway, for folks that need assistance, or you want to give assistance, not just with rent, but for paying for the housing expenses that were listed, this is an astounding way to go. Here's another example. This is going to get a little further. I would say that where my child lives is probably the greatest issue that many of the families we work with deal with, second to nothing. Okay, so this is what I call Mia's Casa, Sue's Casa, and this involves providing a residence here, but still maximizing the SSI. So Sue Casa wants to provide her daughter Mia with a home to live in. Sue is concerned that if she buys the home and puts it in Mia's name, it would be subject to a lien. The other concern would be if Mia were someday to be unable to live in the home and she sold it, it could interfere with her eligibility for public benefits. So for many of the families we work with that help purchase a home for their child to live in, here, we almost always will suggest that they put it in a special needs trust, even if the beneficiary has capacity here, because of the protections the trust has. Sue is unable to purchase she's able to purchase the house, the home, and rather than give the title to Mia, she titles it into a third-party special needs trust with no mortgage. Why do we put the mortgage in there? You know, you add a mortgage of any substance to this, and it's just going to drive the numbers sky high. Remember, that's one of the 10 things. So let's go back to the POMS, and we're into a different set of the POMS. So here's what the POMS says. If a trustee of a special needs trust holds title to a house as a home for the beneficiary, the house would not be a resource to the beneficiary. Okay, that makes sense. It would also not be a resource if the beneficiary moved from the house. Okay, that makes sense. The trust holds a legal title to the house. Therefore, the eligible individual would be considered living in his or her own home because they would have what Social Security has determined an equitable ownership under a trust. So here's what they're doing. They're treating it as if Mia owns the house, even though she really doesn't, okay, here. So for folks on SSI and Medi-Cal, you can own a home of any value and still stay eligible. An eligible individual does not receive in-kind support and maintenance in the form of rent-free shelter while living in the home of which he or she has a ownership interest. So as long as she stays in the home here, she doesn't have to pay rent. Before this POMS came out, we used to have to try to charge them fair market rent, take the money in the trust, pay it back. It was just a real hassle. This made it a lot easier. Accordingly, an individual with equitable ownership under a trust does not receive rent-free shelter because basically they're going to treat it as if they own it, so you don't have to charge them rent. So far, so good. Now, what if Mia likes electricity and water? Now we've got a problem, okay? If the trust pays for other shelter operating expenses, these payments would be income in the form of in-kind support and maintenance in the month the payment is made. So Mia can live in the house without having to pay rent because she has an equitable ownership, but she's still going to have difficulty paying the taxes and utilities without some assistance. Okay? So with that, Sue Casa transfers enough money into Mia's ABLE account, either monthly or annually, to allow her to pay the taxes and utilities with no reduction in benefits. Here. Sue also establishes, and then this was an example that was done with the Golden State Pooled Trust, but she could establish a special needs trust either with a pooled trust or an individual account here, and make the contributions so that the trust could continue to make the contributions in the event that Mia either passes away or loses capacity. Okay, so many of the families we're working with, what they're doing is putting the house in the special needs trust and then enough money to keep feeding the ABLE account to pay for the utilities. By the way, having enough money for maintenance isn't a bad idea as well. Here. Sue feels much more secure because she feels that she has the best of both worlds. Sue has been provided with the residence, and if Mia were ever unable to remain in the residence, the house could be sold and used for her needs without disrupting her eligibility for benefits. If Mia were to be sued, the assets would not be subject to a lawsuit because they'd be protected. And if she were in a situation where it might be subject to a lien, it would be protected as well. Now, the thing that happened here in January 2017 is we changed the rules about Medicaid liens on, especially on houses here. So today there is a lien only on property that where the person used Medi-Cal after the age of 55 that passes through probate. So let's say instead of putting it in the third-party trust, which I still think is the better way to go, you decided, no, we're going to go ahead and give Mia the property directly, you would want to put it into a living trust in Mia's name, because that way, when she passes away, it won't go through probate. It will not be subject to a lien. This is something certainly that if you're looking at using this strategy, you'd want to work with an attorney, and we would be more than happy to work with you who understand these rules and can try to make a little sense of this. Assets that are transferred in the living trust prior to the person passing away then is not subject to Medi-Cal recovery, period. Therefore, you could avoid this by either putting things in a living trust, joint tenancy, which you'll find that all estate planning attorneys hate. There's all sorts of nasty things that can happen, a life estate, or a transfer on death deed. Of all these things, once again, a living trust or a special needs trust is going to be the superior thing here. Now, in a minute, we'll go ahead and take questions, but I do want to mention something going back to Cal Able. Okay. Cal Able was very close to going online, and the vendor that they had selected pulled out at the very last minute. I've had a number of people who have questioned me about that, about whether or not Cal Able is failing or that kind of thing. My personal feeling is that we're in this for the long haul. There is access here to ABLE accounts across the country. And the way this works is almost all programs will allow you to make a transfer. So, for instance, we've been using the Ohio program, which is called the Stable program, a lot. If you decide after Cal Able is up and running, you'd rather have it in the Cal Able account, you can transfer those funds to the Cal Able account, and I believe there is no charge to do that. Okay, so the question comes up, when are ABLE accounts going to be available in California? And the answer is they've been available since June of 2016. If these things have a benefit for you, you'd want to do it now. Here, the only proviso that you would have is if you're using this for savings here, what you'd want to be careful about is, let's say you open up an account in another state. Let's say you open it up in Oregon, okay? And let's say you put $10,000 into that account. Let's say later you move that $10,000 account here to a Cal Able account. Let's say it goes up to like $30,000 and then drops down to, let's say, $15,000 when the beneficiary passes away. The problem you'd have in that case is that because the account originally was started in another state, it's kind of been tainted here, because the way this works is not money in, money out. The danger in that case is up to $10,000 of those funds could be subject to a lien if you care. Okay, so what you would want to do here, if you're using it for savings, is here is you'd want to completely exhaust that account, and then you'd want to turn around here and open a new account and start from scratch. Okay. I will tell you, with the vast majority of families I've worked with and persons with disabilities, we have not been using it for a savings account. We've been using it kind of more of a money in, money out kind of account, but you need to really look at what you're using it for. The last thing before we take questions, and we'll leave this up here, is that to get more information, you can go to our website, and we have this special tab here. So if you go to achievingindependence.com/able, you will find materials on ABLE accounts, and you'll also find a link to our YouTube channels. The other thing is, if you go to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/achieving independence, here you will have access to all of our videos, and I think at this point we have 193 of them here. So with that, Amy is monitoring questions here. Let me just do one thing real quick here, and we can take a few questions from the audience if that's okay here, and then Amy will funnel some of the questions to me. So do we have any questions from the audience here? No? Okay. Yeah. Help me out here. Okay. So,
Hi, can you move or do most 2529 companies offer able accounts?
So the question is, do most 529 plans offer able accounts? And no, some of the 529 companies are, some of them aren't. It really depends on the state.
Okay.
But I'll tell you the other thing that comes up, just to do this, is I'll give you an example in my case. I have a 529 plan that I set up for our grandchildren. We have a grandson and a granddaughter. Lo and behold, my granddaughter, and when we set this up, we had no idea. Lo and behold, my granddaughter has been diagnosed with high functioning autism. Okay. So the question comes up, let's say she were on benefits, should I try to convert that 529 plan to an ABLE account? And I'll be writing papers on that coming up. There's a lot of cases where that's probably not something you want to do, or if you did, you'd want to funnel it over a little bit at a time. The reason being is you actually have more latitude with a 529 plan than you do an ABLE account. And it doesn't interfere with their public benefits in most cases because, like in my case, grandma and grandpa are in charge of that account. It's not a resource to our granddaughter because, and a resource is anything she can control. She can't control that if she wants to get into that account. She's got to go through grandma and grandpa, and good luck with that here. So once again, if you're thinking about converting a traditional 529 plan to an ABLE account, we'll be doing more programs on that coming up. But in most cases, my suggestion is not to do it. We'll take one question here from our YouTube listeners, and the question is, how is it determined if an individual has capacity? Oh, that's a good question. It's kind of like uh, it's kind of like obscenity. You know it when you see it here. It's really, for the most part, it's whether or not you're able to exercise, that you're able to make decisions based on a rational thought process. And as far as trying to determine that specifically, sometimes that can be a little difficult here. But I'll give you an example. I used to work in an autism program, and we had a number of folks who were echolalic. They would respond to all sorts of things, but they're not really doing it through a rational thought process. They're just mimicking back words that they think you want to hear, or in some cases, words you don't want to hear. Here, it's not by a rational thought process here. Going back to my niece, and I think those are the situations where that could be a little bit more challenging. Does she have capacity? She certainly is oriented to time, place, and name and all that. So she certainly has capacity. She's certainly able to express her own opinion. Is she capable, or does she have the skill set to manage a large amount of money? And the answer is absolutely not. So you really have to look at it. The assumption is going to be in California that folks have capacity unless they've been conserved here. So, once again, it's different in different situations, and I understand that's probably going to be an unsatisfying answer. Do we have another question here?
A little bit about the mechanics of this.
Yes.
You are still limited to the $2,000. If you're on SSI or SSDI, you're still limited to the $2,000 a month, correct?
If you're on SSI, on SSI or Medi-Cal, not SSDI, you can have no more than $2,000 on the first moment of the first day of the calendar month.
Okay. So if you have a child who is working part-time and making, something like $1,000 a month, should those check salary should that salary go into the ABLE account?
That is an excellent question. So let's walk through this. For folks that are working disabled, and I should mention, for anyone who is working and is on SSI, SSDI, Medi-Cal, those programs here, a great website is the disabilitybenefits101.org website. The short name is db101.org. So let's dig through that question. The question has to do, let's say somebody is working and on SSI and earning $1,000 a month. And the question was, should you just put the money straight in the ABLE account? Okay, well, here's a couple of things. First off, when you earn it, you're still going to take the $1 for every $2 reduction after the first $65, whether you put it in the ABLE account or not. So putting it in the ABLE account isn't going to help. On the other hand, the problem for many people that are working disabled is they keep going over the $2,000 resource limit. So this is a way where they can put the money in the account and save it maybe for a future date. There is the Able to Work program that just came up where you can add, and I believe it's $11,000. Probably the best place to find out about that would be to Google the Able National Resource Center, and they have a whole section on Able to Work. With that, you can actually add, I believe, an extra $11,000 of earnings. So, like in your case, if the child's earning $1,000 a month here, then they could actually put in 11,000, whatever the number is. It's 11,200, something like that. So they could put in a total of, if those numbers are right, $26,000 a year. Well, you probably would have to put in the 15,000 because, I'm not sure where they get the other 15,000. You could actually add to that. That's still a new program here. Some programs actually have set up relationships with employers where they have direct deposits straight in to the ABLE account. Not that it helps as far as reducing the 2-for-1 reduction, but like most of us, if we don't do it on a regular basis, same thing. If you don't put your money in your 401 or IRA, you're not going to do it. You might have the best of intentions. So it's a way of doing it without having a problem. For folks that are working disabled, this is a really great program. The two places to go would be the db101.org website and the ABLE National Resource Center website, and that'll give you all the information that you need. Here's another one here from YouTube. Why be part of a pool trust if Mia already has a special needs trust? Can't the special needs trust transfer the funds in the ABLE account? Here's the honest truth. The reason that it said the pool trust is because that was taken from a program done for the Golden State Pool Trust. You could use a Golden State Pool you could use a pool trust account. You could use a third-party trust account. It really doesn't make any difference. Here, and I will correct that for the next presentation. So if you had somebody, and for those of you that are not familiar with a pool trust is different than your traditional special needs trust in that there are hundreds of pool trusts across the country. I happen to be the trustee of the Golden State Pool Trust. The difference, a pool trust is kind of like a cross between a 401k and a special needs trust. You don't get your own document. What you get is an account, but they function exactly the same here. And so once again, whether it is a pool trust or an individual trust, you can tie a special needs trust into an ABLE account. And for those of you that have special needs trusts, there are two types of special needs trusts. One is what's called a third-party trust or the estate planning trust. That's the one where maybe you're setting someone up for a child or somebody or a loved one. In our case, we set one up for our niece. Okay, here, a self-settled trust is a trust where it's the benefit recipient's money. Maybe it came from a lawsuit or money that came to them directly. That's a self-settled trust, and it's a very different animal, but you could tie either one of them into an ABLE account. And the really nice thing about it is that one thing about special needs trusts is the trustee has sole and absolute discretion and the beneficiary has none, no matter what kind of trust you're dealing with. In this case, you can actually take up to $15,000 a year and put it in that ABLE account here and let the beneficiary exercise their own discretion and do whatever they want with it without having to ask the trustee permission here. And so it's giving really more control to the person with a disability that we've never had before. Prior to this, prior to ABLE accounts, the trustee had to scrutinize every single distribution. Now, sometimes maybe that's desirable, but sometimes maybe it isn't. Maybe you want the beneficiary to be able to have some latitude over their life. Here's another question. Is the Able to Work program earnings an automatic benefit? Does SSA know that the extra deposits where the earnings are, even if you stay below the max? Social Security probably isn't monitoring what's going on, but we have to go back to this. If you earn it, you're supposed to report it, and you're still going to take the 2-for-1 reduction. So going back to the question we had before, somebody who's earning $1,000, even if it's direct deposited into the account here, you still have a duty to report it. And the other part of that is, even if you're thinking, well, maybe it wouldn't get caught, anything that has the beneficiary's Social Security number on it, Social Security has access to it. So even if you tried to get away with something, there's a pretty good chance you wouldn't. Okay, so might as well stay on the up and up. Any last questions here? We exhausted the. Did you have a question in the back, sir?
So I know for the regular account, you have investment options. What resources are there to learn about what investment options is there?
So the question was that, once again, all ABLE accounts have different investment options. Now, the real fact is, the way it's playing out, there's a group called a consortium, and there's a group called something else. So a lot of groups are coming together. So what you would find is, like, Ohio is administering accounts in, I think, 12 other states. There's another thing called the partnership, which is doing that. So you probably would find the investments pretty similar between those two groups. But the thing about it is that the websites will usually have information about what are the investment options. And the other part of that is, if I know here is that if you go to the ABLE National Resource Center, they have a link where you can go state by state, and it will tell you about what those investment options are. Okay, here. So there's a pretty wide range of options for different programs here. And most of them you can mix and match. I know for my niece's account, when we set that up, I think there's about 5 or 6 different portfolios, and you could take 20% of this, 30% of that, and all that, but you can only change the mix twice a year. Yes. Any last questions here? If there's not, what I'm going to do is I want to thank you so much for watching today. For those of you that are watching this on YouTube here, you can certainly reach us here by calling the Dale Law Firm here or emailing us here. Okay, and we have one last question, and then I'm going to say goodbye. Okay, follow up. So if you have an ABLE account and you're earning money, you still get the deduction in your SSI payment, but you can save more per year in your account. And the answer is that is absolutely correct. Okay, but that actually opens up options for persons with disabilities we've never had before. So I want to thank you all. With that, this is part of a series, so we'll be doing more of these programs as time goes on. Also, if there's something you'd like to hear on one subject or another, we're trying to build up our library. So with that, I want to thank you very much, and I'm going to say goodbye to our viewers